assumptions that what's important are the interactions, the process, rather than the structures and the enduring components of it. And so social cultural theories start from an epistemological position, assuming that what we know is only known through interaction, i.e. empirical. So contrast this to kind of your traditional science approaches, in which how do we come to know things? We come to know by testing the real world and trying to control for things in that world. The argument is that even when we do that, the heart of that interaction still comes back to social interaction, i.e. science doesn't get done alone. Your observations by themselves are not particularly reliable. Indeed, the Greeks used to make much of this, and they used to make the argument that if we can't agree on what is too hot and what is too cold, things that are basic to human survival, then we're not likely to be able to agree on what is too dark, too light, what is too small to see. That there's no reason to trust your senses because we know our senses are fallible in so many ways. They're predisposed to perceiving what we want to believe. And in other comm classes, you've probably had numerous examples of the ways in which our senses fail us. I know that in 180, for example, one of the things that you get introduced to is the notion that by focusing on one thing, you necessarily stop seeing other things. With the gorilla video. Remember?
Yes.
Good.
That was funny.
Good.
That was funny.
Yeah.
That was way funny.
Yep. And given that, even with the sciences, like the testing occurs through the social interactions. There's a reason that articles are only regarded as valid after going through peer review processes, right? In the same way, then, through interaction, we come to construct what is valid and viable. And the fact that we're coming to agreement on conflict resolutions is no less reliable of a method than coming to agreement on what data suggests. Social cultural theories are particularly useful when things are fluid or chaotic. Thus, the one that we're looking at is particularly useful, you'll find, when we get into situations of conflict. And if conflict is something that you find really interesting as a focus of study, there's a lot of comm theories that approach conflict from a variety of different perspectives. And there's a class called conflict management that Dr. DeCaro teaches, I think, fairly regularly, hopefully.
The mediation?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in that one this semester.
And we're hoping to have it on the books fairly regularly. And you'll find that there's a lot of different approaches, but that all of them are, in essence, social cultural theories. That's not absolutely true. If you get into international studies, for example, those quote-unquote realist theories, like poli-sci folks oftentimes like to make an argument that power is the way to understand conflict interactions. And that's a systems-based, i.e. cybernetic theory, in essence. And then they call it realpolitik, and the name itself is an interesting example of semiotics. So, CMM is an example of a social cultural theory. One of the things I like about it is that it does a really good job of reminding us that the agreement is where the important things happen. We don't have to reach actual agreement to solve a conflict. What we need is to get to a good enough place of overlap, right? And so, in the same way that with conversation analysis, the emphasis was always on not just the first two turns to the dialogue, but the third turn, where we start echoing back. CMM keeps a lot of that focus, where it should. And so the coordination component of coordinated management of meaning forces us to look at not what one person says, not what the response is, but how that response gets picked up and either furthered or shunted off. The spirals that Pearce and Cronin kind of lay out, it's easier to see how that makes sense when you start applying it to something. So if you look at the diagram on page 74, one of the things he talks about is that every interaction, every turn in a given page is already embedded in a whole lot of other actions, contexts, things that we think about, but it's also things that we don't think about directly in relation to the current interaction, the current part of the process, but are integral to having it gotten to where it is and where it can go next. Culture is one example of that. Culture exists only because we recreated every moment in every interaction, but it also does influence those interactions because we keep reconstructing it. Same thing with things like relationships. Teacher-student relationships are not somehow a given. They exist only so long as we negotiate that arrangement ongoingly. And so where our systems theories tend to take that teacher-student relationship as a given and look at the ways in which we can alter it, maybe, but also the ways in which it perpetuates itself and the ways in which it stabilizes other things around it. This theory looks at what are the things you do to recreate your studentness. What are the things that I do that you notice in which I'm actively having to recreate constantly that the authority of the teacher position, because it's not a given. There's nothing that keeps you here going through this interaction. So he creates these nested circles, but the important thing to notice from this nesting is that what elements of context are important are going to be different for you and for me. And I can do things that pull one in or another, or make clear to you what I'm responding to, but you might not know what I'm responding to in an interaction. And it might be that something else is going to stay on your mind, and so I'm going to have to adapt to that if I'm ever to make sense of our interaction. Because it's at best a messy process. And so that's why the links between our turns are always depicted as being sinuous curves, because what we're trying to do is point out the ways in which our turns never actually manage to overlap in terms of understanding, but that we're always messy,
Yeah.
right? Struggling to try to pull things together. And so that's why we get
Lopsided things.
right, lopsided, yeah, lopsided, exactly. Lopsided curves. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, that kind of reminds me of this one comic that I saw. It's like what, pretty much all the steps in marketing and design process.
Mhm.
So, like, it was for a swing set,
Okay.
and what, for a bunch of squares, what the architect designed, what the customer described, what it was built for, what the engineers did with it, stuff
What
like
they
that.
think it is.
How
Right,
it's
the
marketed.
engineers' diagram of it that is this system of forces. Like
Yeah.
all the lines and the fulcrum points rather than actual swing set equipment
Yeah.
that has, little
But
yellow tabs or whatever.
yeah, and then like just random stuff like what the constructors interpreted it as, like,
And what the kids do with it,
yeah.
right? Which has nothing to do. And yet it lines up in some ways. Like you can can see how that process carries forwards, but the kids are coming into this from such a different position. And that's, yeah, it's part of the joy of kids.
And what the kids wanted was like a tire swing.
And they're gonna pretend it is.
Yeah.
Or a rocket.
Well, once you get it going fast enough.
Right, well, kids are good for that. Right? They're going to figure out ways to make it behave more dangerously than the engineers ever intended.
Yes.
History of long innovation regarding new ways to break ourselves. Playground equipment.
I definitely relate to that.
Not even playground equipment.
Yeah, seriously, anything. Classroom equipment, playground equipment, bedrooms. So, since this one works a lot better in action, I thought maybe it would be fun to look at it. And I thought it was a really funny article. There's just something so, in the same way that I value that children kind of break further from the semiotic circles, I really love the bears in this article. Like, all the rest of us are turning the government shutdown into an occasion for angst.
They're having a ball.
Yeah, what it really is a new feeding ground, new game to play for bears. And thinking about it from that perspective makes it just less unpleasant of a conflict. So let's start from the bears' position. Let's see, I'm totally anthropomorphizing our bears, yes, in case you're wondering. I don't really believe bears think in this way, in this kind of elaborate way. But I thought it might be fun kind of mapping out the conflict from the bears' perspective and then expanding outwards from there to the state's perspective, and then only afterwards noticing the ways in which it's influenced by the ongoing conflict, the story that gets told in the national media. Does that make sense? All right. At the heart of this conflict, what would you say would be the bears' understanding of what's going on as the core of this conflict?
Whether or not to take out the trash?
More food.
So the conflict is over the control of this latched substance,
Yes.
right?
Bear-proof thing.
And that's important primarily because what it is for them is food, right? And so this is, yes, the Speech Act, we'll call it a Speech Act, even though Speech Act often gets used to refer to things that are nonverbal behaviors, and the leaving of the thing unlatched is a Speech Act for purposes of this analysis, for this theory, in fact, would almost always accept nonverbals as speech acts. And right around that is important stuff like this is how I live, right? And then outside of that is this understanding of episode, I would argue, in the sense that now we start having this unlatched, it becomes defined as a maybe food source, maybe this can be an ongoing, maybe this becomes then a good place to be.
The hibernation factor.
Right, this is a good timing for it too. Seriously, back to this notion of like what bears do, prep for winter's hibernating, good timing of us. And so we define this in terms of an episode. And it's probably, in a larger sense, defined in terms of their relationship with humans, that is probably largely one of conflict, defined in terms of ongoing tensions, probably, but who knows really. Does that make sense? All right, let's think about it from a park ranger's perspective. What's at the core of it?
An episode?
Agreed, absolutely. Would everybody else agree?
Yep.
The key thing here is, for the park ranger, this episode is the crisis. The moment is fraught with all of this weight because it's budget shutdown, it's job security, it's also park security, right? Because now we've created an ongoing threat in some sense.
Yep.
Does that make sense? What would you say influences their interpretation of that most closely? What are the relevant contexts for trying to make sense of that episode for the park ranger, Friday?
Well, it's their role in that park.
Okay, I would agree. Not even just their role in the park,
But with also with the bears too.
with the Bears and also with the National.
Yep.
Are we in agreement about that?
So you're
As
saying the
being most
relationship?
critical factor? Exactly. Exactly. We're all in agreement. Good. And in line with that, I would guess probably most of what we would say would be that identity goes next.
Mm-hmm.
Let's set as contrast our article ends with shifting back a step, which is an appropriate thing to do at the conclusion of an article, to talk about the governor's position on this conflict. And he's viewing it really differently, isn't he? It suddenly seems like an entirely different episode, or speech act, or what is the governor viewing as central to this?
The fact that they have chosen a nationwide approach, which is completely inappropriate.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And so if you had to label that, y'all, according to Relationship, Identity, Culture, Episode, Speech Act, where's the focus for the governor?
Relationship?
Maybe relationship, because it's clearly relationship to federal versus state.
Yeah.
Everything gets viewed in some sense, that tension is an ongoing one.
Yeah. I would agree. I'd say it's his relationship with these Anilka and the other one, the U.S. Fish and Game Wildlife Services.
Right. But Anilka suggests one other thing that we might be pulling in as being central here. Since that's what he's using as his argument, what does that pull in?
The episode? Or
In this case, we're defining it in terms of a history that's
okay.
quite distinct from this immediate episode, is in fact somehow being defined in contrast to the immediate episode, right?
He's saying according to the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, they're doing it wrong.
Right,
Yes.
right. And why is it that important? Right, yes, yes. This is an example of,
Well, I'm just thinking that it starts to pull, rather than national versus government, it's more Alaska versus everybody else.
Right.
Identity.
I would agree with that. Does that seem like what you're getting at? That what's important here is our Alaska identity. It's not even the history of state-federal tensions,
No.
which every state has to some extent or another, right?
We just have a unique one because we're Alaska.
Right. It's our Alaska identity that's at threat here.
That's right.
And when you start messing with our Alaska identity, obviously our governor's going to feel really threatened by all the components of this, right? And would argue that the other thing that's really central in the way that the governor defines it is that what that Alaska identity relies upon, draws from, is our Alaska culture. In particular, trying to keep alive subsistence as one of the defining features, right?
And in a sense, the bears are helping them out.
Yes. one sense they are. Even though I think he would be troubled by this new relationship with bears.
But they're working for him right now.
Yeah, actually, they kind of are. And so the easier, if you want to try to then start, Laura's right, the thing why it's worth spending time doing this, in addition to trying to make sense of how other people are making sense of the conflict, ideally what you'd like to be able to do with a theory like this is move from just understanding the conflict at a better level to doing something about the conflict, right? And so we start to look, once we finish this mapping, what we start to look for is where are the places that there can be some movement towards each other, alliances, even temporary, even partial alliances, right? Where the bears may not agree we're in an alliance. The bears may think we're still in a relationship of essential enmity.
Yeah.
But we can still have pragmatic outcomes. We can construct, in a temporary process, admittedly, a sort of useful next step as the next best thing. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's finish mapping our governor's imagined layers, and then we'll see if we can figure out anything that we can do towards conflict resolution. We had talked previously about the fact that this is defined as an episode as being probably pretty important. Although, I don't know, how many of y'all would think that relationship goes next, or versus how many think episode goes next? Relationship. Who wants to vote for relationship next? Isn't that, who would vote for the episode as the next layer? Why do I don't know. Where are the rest of y'all on this?
Well, I think that it would change maybe. If we were not in a government shutdown, I would not say episode. But if because we are, I would. Because the increased look at how we perceive government's role in things is heightened in this particular set of time. If it was last year at this time, and for some other reason, the Park Service got defunded and we weren't quite as, where...
You're so right, because last year, in fact, we were talking about
shutting down
some of the Park Service.
Yeah,
or
and shutting down
their role
things
here.
and to close them down and to bring them in. And there was far less any sort of conversation about it because it wasn't as widespread. But now that it is all Park Service, and that it is everybody across the board, I would say that the governor has a higher platform to talk about this issue because of the episode that we are in.
Yeah. But so he's going to kind of use episode to get at a relationship that's pretty ongoingly unpleasant. Anyways.
I still think you could argue the other way, the exact opposite way.
Could.
You could use this
Indeed, I was waffling about it pretty severely.
I'm still not decided. I still think it could both ways.
Well, and
You do that.
yeah, I mean, one of the things I could do, and I don't think this is problematic from the theorist perspective, maybe y'all would disagree with me, but I think Pearson Cronin would be okay with it if I drew this into a spiral line. How do I can't, my art skills aren't up for it.
Well, it's kind of like their strange loop.
Yeah, they're strange loop,
But
exactly.
the never-ending staircase.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Okay, so picture that drawing.
Yeah.
Imagine it. Make it so.
There you go.
Either which way, the speech act is nothing more than a hook that I can use, an insight that I can, turn this into a good news story with. It's a trigger, but it's not more than a trigger. Agreed?
Yeah.
And so what the bears are actually doing, what's important to them is not what's important to the governor, clearly. Right? What's important to the governor is marginally important to our bears. They like going about being bears. The governor likes them going about being bears. It's useful for the bears to go about being bears because it lets us go about being Alaskan. And we can't be Alaskan if there are no wilderness spaces in which bears and humans can potentially interact so that we can make that a safe interaction.
Yes. But it seems like the park rangers are the ones who
Are really far outside of
Yeah.
this
they have the
particular
worst.
loop.
side of it.
Yup. I guess I should have probably finished trying to draw out my park rangers' definition. Because right now we don't have any really good ways to imagine bringing our park rangers into better alignment.
Well, it's not their job. If you look at it that way, it's not their function. They are there. They have to maintain this fine line between us being Alaskans and the governor wanting this, and the people, they have to maintain that fine line.
Maybe if we drew national, we would find more alignment there, and maybe we could find allies for them as well. But right now,
I think it starts to get into so in the thing it says, typically I don't have to deal with garbage, but now I am. So as it starts, the Speech Act, I would say be the next one around the identity.
that's
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
Agreed. And that may be useful.
And then for that one, it's kind of, could almost be seen as, if they do take it as the it's not my job sort of standpoint, and then which overloads the trash compactors, and then the bears get to it, which gets to everything else, versus, because I know they have to go to school for quite a while to be able to get to that position, and it could be seen as a downgrade or a,
Threat to identity.
yeah.
Yeah, agreed. And since it's not central to the governor's position, I'm sure the governor could find room in his heart to maybe imagine it a way to deal with the trash other than making the poor person in charge physically handle it. Maybe the governor could intervene long enough to use the boroughs, trash people to help out. Because the borough, isn't on hold the way.
Everybody else is, for now.
Right. Although the governor doesn't have direct control over that.
No, and I would say that it's always interesting, especially in Alaska, when you start going down between federal, state, borough, city.
Right.
And then getting those multiple layers of things, because even if the borough mayor has control over something, it might end up actually being the city mayor who has to carry it out, or so those ones get entertaining as well.
Nevertheless, it seems like the step would be to try to figure a way to realign this speech act, the act of the trash not latching.
I think actually the one to pull in might be actually the culture.
Oh.
As to figuring out the way that the culture could overlap everything else, because if the culture of Alaska is to protect wildlife, and that's going to link closely into the identity of the park ranger, and that the culture of Alaska is to
Protect bears as well.
Yes, exactly. But also to provide wildlands.
but to not only protect the wildlife, but the land in which it is, and then for people not to have this, Alaska you think of as the untouched last frontier, and if there is litter all over it, obviously it is not the untouched
Alaska.
right. It is not our cultural identity that we hold to. So I think that if you could maybe pull in
Right.
some of the culture, and then
Right.
for the bears, you want them not to be dependent on human beings. They should be this wild and free thing like the rest of Alaska.
Right. And so for bears, culture and identity kind of are a collapsed thing, I think.
I think a lot of,
Or I could make that argument.
yeah. I think that it's interesting with Alaska is that, okay, so if our culture and our identity honestly kind of link in very closely to each other, because our identity is that we're all independent and free and here to do our own pioneering thing, and then
But
the
that's also our
culture of
culture.
Alaska is to do our own independent pioneering thing. They seem to link pretty closely to each other.
Yeah, and so this pairing may not be unusual. And indeed, in other communities, that's true also. Culture and identity are often very closely aligned, right? Okay, so that makes sense as a way to try to move forwards with that. And we could imagine that once I redefine that, what might be our next, what would be the sign of uptake? What would it look like? What would we imagine to be the next part of that process? Like, how do I know if our new emphasis, bringing culture into the mix more closely as a way to try to conflict solve?
I think the governor should voice his support for the park rangers and help and somehow let them know that he is interested in finding a solution to get them help to pick up the trash. Because again, the bears cannot become habituated. Or yes, we
Right.
are gonna have bear people human encounters.
Yeah,
So
Yeah.
I think the governor could step up and start supporting his park rangers, and they would feel then therefore like, yeah, okay, maybe he does care. I can hang this for a while because it helps on the way.
yeah, I suspect that even though we may not find an easy solution, because as Caitlin pointed out, there's more steps involved in that. Even just the statement of doing what we can to find a solution for now,
Yeah,
so that our bears don't get habituated
exactly.
and our park rangers don't have to do all the physical labor by themselves.
Well, and then they're also gonna start having to shoot bears.
Right. Right. The national doesn't come into the picture at all, which makes for a much nicer way to approach really big picture conflicts. And I think that's probably often true, is that trying to approach the shutdown in all its entire messy glory, I'm gonna guess there's not much by way of resolutions if you try to take up the whole big picture of it.
No.
So Mother Teresa quote, if I see the whole, I will not act, but if I see the individual, I will.
I didn't know that. That's a lovely quote.
Her view of the folks in Calcutta is that if I see the individual person, I can help the individual person, but if I see the multiple and the whole, I get overwhelmed and I do nothing.
And that's a lovely emphasis on the difference between social cultural theories and cybernetic systems theories. Both of them are approaching from a group perspective in some sense,
In some sense, yeah.
but the difference is in the way in which we talk about individual actions constructing actively. It implies that we have choice in the matter. And so like rhetorical theories, social cultural theories tend to assume that there's a certain degree of agency, i.e. that we can reconstruct, that speech acts matter enough that we could imagine a speech act to realign the entire conflict system.
Okay. Am I the only one that went to the crucifixion of Jesus?
Yeah,
You're
sure.
that old?
Well, no, but I mean, as far as a speech act,
Okay.
something that occurred that reformed a lot of the way that we all think and push. I mean, it even broke up how we do our dates, AD, BC.
True.
You know, and I think that that was a culminating moment in human civilization where we kind of dramatically shifted in one way or the other. It was kind of the cornerstone of Christianity, which is the cornerstone of one of the 4 major religions in the world. So I would say, as far as a speech act, that's the
That can
biggest
make a
one
big
that I
difference.
could think of.
Sure, that's a good speech act. I think we can probably, the argument that I'm tempted to make is always going to be, yes, that speech act was important, but much more important was the later interaction with power, i.e. Constantine
Yeah.
choosing to use that as the symbol of conquest, took over the Roman Empire.
It didn't hurt that he went through and said, "You Christian? No. Die."
Yeah.
Well, okay, I'm Christian. That's what. Yeah.
Right? And so, right, that's my systems theory coming back at answering that. But yeah, the Speech Act itself. One of the things that's nice about it is it does maintain that sense of optimism.
I like to think I'm a glass full person.
Yay. Yep. I get tired of my own cynicism every once in a while. Especially because every once in a while I teach people, like students in my class, pick up on the degree of cynicism and think that what I'm trying to teach is a class in cynicism instead of a class in theory or and they start echoing it back to me enlarged and focused, and then I get really tired of my own cynicism. So one of the things I like teaching is this stuff because it's really a good antidote. It's very hopeful. And moreover, it's really well supported in terms of actually being able to achieve solid, good outcomes. And the article that's on Blackboard right now is written by the same theorist that came up with the theory, and it gives you a small sampling of kind of the work that he's been doing. It's interesting, especially for those of you in the discipline more or less, one of the things that's been an affirmation of the utility of this theory. Like, you want to talk about having real-world applications. The folks that came up with this are all of them no longer teaching because they now are pulled in as mediators pretty much full-time. And so he runs an institute that does civil interventions.
It's reminding me a lot of the guy that came up with the win-win sort of concept.
Game theory? What's that?
Yeah, kind of.
Okay.
Same sort of concept. He did a lot with, and it's become more pervasive, I would say, around as far as trying to figure out in all contexts if you're designing a building or just that both sides of anything end up coming out of it with a reasonable feeling like they've won something, which I think is now why the government is having so many issues, is because everybody feels like they need to win something.
Fisher and Urey. Yeah.
But trying to figure out where we
Read
can
that with a certain amount of cynicism. Sorry, go ahead.
where we can
Yeah.
align for these ones to figure out where
Yeah.
everybody feels like they've won. Where,
Uh-huh.
putting the bears into it is a little harder, but they
No,
won't
I
get
think
shot. They're
They don't get
winning.
shot. They've had some food to help with the winter hibernation. They're going to go into hibernation soon, right? Because surely soon enough we're going to hit cold.
No,
Right?
no, we won't. We won't get cold.
We are so far behind on getting to cold already.
Yeah, no, we're not. No,
But
we're
you
not.
just wait till we
Hush.
get to the cold.
Hush. It will happen. It doesn't need to happen now.
Just like, what is it? Like this last spring, we didn't need to see the grass until Spring Fest was halfway through.
Yeah, it was a very late start, and so I guess I should be glad that we have a very late start to our next winter. It
Yes.
just feels
Blissful?
um,
Happy?
Yeah, but it's gonna be
Odd.
cold. We have a cold winter.
and
It's
you
gonna be
may
an
be
interesting
right,
winter.
unfortunately. So yeah, we should be outside enjoying it for now. Okay, so the plan is on Wednesday we're actually going to have to gather here because the activity in question is not one that I can send everybody off doing independently. That's problematic because I feel like we're behind on trying to want to get through as many theorists as we can, and it's partly my own fault because I keep getting really into our theorists and talking about it at length when I need to be moving faster.
Did we ever go over the last one? The toilet one?
We didn't. I still have I've been hoping to get some responses on Blackboard. I've got most of the pictures posted, and I did. I posted yours. They're up there.
Tried to do this.
One of them isn't, because I was the rest are mostly all up there, and so maybe we can glance over them. It's been interesting because I hadn't really quite realized some of the things that we use as markers for gender are kind of interesting. Like how we decide which gender the bathroom is. I would not associate gray as one way or another, for example, but maybe there is an association. I just didn't know it.
Should have gone for one of the dorm bathrooms.
We have definitely some examples from campus. There are some that are so clearly campus bathrooms, like, oh my gosh, that's UAF all over. That's
Why?
the crampedness of it, the ways in which the space kind of comes together.
Makes no sense whatsoever.
I feel like,
Convenient?
yeah, I mean, it's tight. It's like,
I smashed my hand on the toilet paper dispenser, closing the door because I forgot to hold it up high. It was in the handicap
you
stall.
know, it's not unusual that
It just pissed me off.
urban universities always feel like there's not enough space,
Yeah.
right? And space is at a premium. Look how much you pay for park, and this is nothing compared to other universities. How much we pay for parking is so nothing.
Really?
But yeah, compared to other universities that are urban, like in an urban environment. I know Fairbanks isn't terribly urban, but we get some of this.
Just isn't used to paying for parking at all.
Well, right.
So-
Because we think we have all this.
Right.
It's Alaska. We have space.
Right.
But
We'll
the
just sprawl.
university does not, in some sense. I mean, we do,
Yeah.
but we build tight. We build really tight to maximize.
Well, and I think that it's less about building tight, but more about that every building within Fairbanks that I've ever seen goes through this stage of building and then maximizing what is built. So all of a
Right.
sudden you're putting people, this is an office. No, this is a closet. No, it's an office now.
We're now officing it
Oh.
officially.
Okay, but I swear it's a closet.
Right.
And then
Right.
so it builds out until
Right.
the point of, usually it comes as some sort of outside person saying, no, this is getting to the point of condemning. Like, you can't stick people in this anymore because it is not healthy. And then finally new build. So it has to go through that process.
Yeah, and you can see the physical evidence of it in some of the pictures. Anyways, thank you for the recording effort, and I will